Throughout medieval Europe, queens and princesses carried not just crowns, but crushing expectations. Their value was tied to one thing above all: virginity. When royal marriages were forged, these weren't just unions of love or companionship. They were weapons of diplomacy, sealing alliances between kingdoms. And the purity of the bride? It became proof of legitimacy, a guarantee of unbroken lineage, and a matter of state security. But how was this purity confirmed? The answer is unsettling. In many royal courts, humiliating tests of virginity were carried out, rituals that stripped women of privacy and dignity. Priests, midwives, or physicians were summoned to examine queens and princesses, their bodies becoming evidence in front of judgmental eyes. Some courts even staged these tests in near-public settings, with witnesses waiting for confirmation. Imagine being a young girl, sent from a distant land to marry a king you had never met, only to be inspected like property. A single verdict, pure or impure, could decide your fate, your marriage, and sometimes even your life. For queens, failing this test meant more than shame. It meant accusations of betrayal, annulled marriages, or even execution. For kings, a bride's supposed purity was tied to political stability, heirs, and the very survival of dynasties. Virginity was never just personal. It was political. And yet, these so-called tests were far from scientific. They were steeped in myth, superstition, and manipulation. A rival faction at court could easily spread rumors, claiming a queen had failed her test, stripping her of power and tarnishing her reputation forever. Still, many endured these trials in silence. Some passed, some resisted, and some paid the ultimate price for a standard that was impossible to truly measure. Over time, as science advanced and politics evolved, the practice of public virginity testing began to fade. But its legacy remains, an echo of a past where women's worth was decided not by their wisdom, leadership, or strength, but by an invasion of their most private selves. The virginity tests of medieval royalty remind us of a haunting truth. Power often came at the cost of human dignity, and queens bore the heaviest burden.